Our gospel this morning comes to us from Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd. And he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. They took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
So what is it that makes antiques so valuable? Priceless even. I love watching the Antiques Roadshow, so it's a question I get in my mind a lot. It certainly isn't because it's just a table, a lamp, a rug, or other accoutrement, because those are readily available at any price point, at any store you go to. You can get the pre-assembled, all ready-to-go type, or you can do it the do-it-yourself, weird little man IKEA assembly type. So it's not exactly what the antique is that makes it valuable. So what about functionality? A table we buy at IKEA or Target or Walmart or a furniture store can be used without concern. We put it in our house, we set stuff on it, maybe we don't use coasters, maybe it gets a scratch, maybe your daughter or son or grandchildren color on it, and you know what? We're okay with that. That's what it's made for, right? That table was made to be used, and it's getting used. But we wouldn't set anything on an antique table for fear that any one of those things might happen. It might get a ring on it, it might get colored on, it might get a dent in it. So functionality isn't what makes an antique valuable either. You wouldn't walk on an antique rug or sleep in an antique quilt. What makes them so valuable is the fact that they are so rare. They're scarce. Perhaps that antique is the only one left in existence. It's really and truly on its own. And many times that's because the tables did get used and abused, as ours do, and the rugs were walked on and played on and spilled on and crawled on, as rugs are meant to be. Even those things that were created by the master artisans that we all look for when we're antique shopping would have been used. But that means those antiques that we do find are even more unique, and we treasure them and use them as heirlooms, but they're never used for what they're meant to be used for. And I think about that because then I think about other things that we hear. Antiques are special because they're scarce. But think about advertisements we hear on television or the radio. Limited time offer. While supplies last. You'll never see deals this great again until the next Labor Day. See, all of these are ploys to trigger that sense of urgency in our minds. That idea that we have to get out there, we have to get going, because we're conditioned to react if we think something will run out. In some ways, it starts to trigger our fight or flight response. We get antsy, and we're like, well, what if I need that? If I don't act now, I might miss out, even though I don't need it. But if I don't go now and I don't buy it and I need it later, I'm going to be paying more, so wouldn't it be better to go buy it now? Yet in reality, if we stop just for a minute, we realize there's plenty of whatever it is that they are selling. There's no danger of it running out because they're going to keep making more, even if it takes a couple months for it to get back in supply. And we also need to think about the fact that the sale prices aren't really sale prices because they've raised the price so that they can lower the price. And in the end, you're not saving anything. But we have to admit that oftentimes we're fairly gullible and we will fall for it. Because that myth of scarcity is meant to provoke our consumeristic habits and create profits for the company at hand. And yet we have to admit the crowds follow the sales. Now in the Gospel of Matthew, we hear how Jesus withdrew to a deserted place by boats. And yet the crowds still followed when they heard where he was going. And they somehow met him where he was at. Now, Jesus is a much better person than I, because if I was withdrawing, I would be none too happy to find a huge crowd. But he was patient and giving and kind. He healed their sick and had compassion for the people. And he was there all day. And I can picture it, the sun's starting to set, maybe the heat is starting to finally go away, and the day is drawing to a close, and it was evening. So the disciples are ever practical, always. So they go up, hey, Jesus, it's getting close to supper time, and we're getting hungry, or the crowds are getting hungry. So let's just send everyone away so they can go to the towns and buy some food and be fed for the night. There's no place here for them to buy food at any rate. And Jesus kind of looks at him and he says, nah, you don't have to do that. Here, let's just feed them here. Of course, the disciples, because they're practical, had already done the math. They knew what was going on, and they're like, Jesus, we don't exactly have enough food. Because in their books, the food was scarce. All we have are 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Jesus, that just isn't going to work. Yeah, Jesus doesn't skip a beat, and he says, bring them here. We'll see what we can do. And then it talks about how Jesus, in the same way that he would later do at the Last Supper, blessed the bread, and broke it, and gave it to the disciples. And then the disciples took it from there and handed it out to the crowds. And that's when the amazing thing starts to happen. I don't know how it happened. It's a miracle, right? But the disciples began to disperse the food, and what they believed to be scarce had multiplied before their eyes. The bread and the fish suddenly fed a crowd of 5,000 men, not counting women and children. So it is quite possible, and not outside the realm of possibility, that 10,000 or more people were actually fed. I don't know about you, but that's a pretty miraculous way to feed some people. And not only that, not only were they fed till they were satisfied, there was leftovers. And the fun thing about this, normally when people hear the leftovers in the 12 baskets, they think these tiny little dainty Easter baskets that we have to put the little Easter eggs in, and it all looks so pretty, and there's 12 of those. But no, that's not what the Greek says. So in the Greek, the idea is there was an extreme, abundant overflow of pieces left over that filled 12 big, heavy baskets. There was certainly no scarcity of food on that day. what was thought to be scarce by the disciples turned into an overabundance of provisions, a miracle of godly proportions, to be sure. And it was another inbreaking of the kingdom of God on earth. It was truly miraculous that so many people were fed on that day, and it is unlikely that many in the crowd, had they been sent away, would have had the money or the resources to be able to buy the food that they needed. Poverty was just as real then as it is now, and it is an issue that comes to the forefront of many people's minds at this time of the year. As school's about to start and we're gearing up for our clothing drives, there have been shoe drives, school supply drives, all sorts of things to help students whose parents may not be able to give them those things that they need. And then we begin to discuss what items we need for our backpacks, which I'm so glad to see a table full of stuff back there. We start talking about what we need for our backpacks that the kids can take home for the weekends to make sure that they have meals on that Saturday and Sunday before they can come back to school and get the food at school on Monday. See, to them, food is a scarce resource, and they need the help. Yet at other times on the news and in the world in general, we hear the very real needs of these students become overshadowed by debates over cutting funding for free and reduced lunch. Debates that reduce the children to numbers and statistics instead of hungry little human beings who need food just as much as anyone else and have no way of making any money to pay for it themselves. While the 2015 poverty levels decreased slightly in the United States as compared to 2014, and the 2016 statistics aren't out yet, the poverty rate for children under the age of 18 is still 19.7%. Essentially, 1 out of every 5 children lives in poverty. 1 in 5. That's a lot of children. You have to remember, whenever we're looking at 1 in 5 children, that's going to include their whole family unit that they come from. And then whenever I put it in that idea, and you think about it as an actual child, and then you think about the other debates that come, the other entitlement programs, welfare, food stamps, Medicaid, unemployment. You know, we think of these things at a high level, never thinking about who else it's affecting when we're talking about it. Things that the children in those families have no control over, but who are very much affected when changes are made because their parents are either deemed worthy or not worthy by people claiming Christian values on all sides. But the interesting thing is, every single one of them are living by this idea of the myth of scarcity. But let me tell you, if Jesus lived by the myth of scarcity, then the crowd would have left hungry that day. If God operated on the myth of scarcity, then we wouldn't be here today. Walter Brueggemann, an Old Testament theologian and scholar, wrote an article in 1999 from which I drew my sermon title. His article is titled, "The Liturgy of Abundance, the Myth of Scarcity." In it, Brueggemann pulls no punches, saying, "We who are now the richest nation and are today's main coveters. We never feel that we have enough. We have to have more and more, and this insatiable desire destroys us. Whether we are liberal or conservative Christians, we must confess that the central problem of our lives is that we are torn apart by the conflict between our attraction to the good news of God's abundance and the power of our belief in scarcity. A belief that makes us greedy, mean, and unneighborly. We spend our lives trying to sort out that ambiguity. Because it is left for us to choose whether or not we live into the liturgy of abundance that we see even from Genesis 1, that God made for us and calls us to, or if we want to live with that myth of scarcity. Earlier in that same article, Brueggemann also drew a comparison between the Pharaoh in Exodus and Hitler that I found intriguing. And he said, because Pharaoh, like Hitler after him, is afraid that there aren't enough good things to go around, he must try to have them all. Because he is fearful, he is ruthless. And I think it was that last phrase that really intrigued me. And I thought about how true is that today? Remembering that this was written in 1999, and yet 18 years later, I can look around me and say, wow, not much has changed. We are ruthless when we fear that we will lose rights, so no one else can have those rights. We are ruthless when we fear that one person might abuse the system, so we'd rather no one get anything. We are ruthless when we fear for our safety, so we allow mistreatment and abuses as long as it means other people are caught too. But my friends, this is not how we are meant to live. We were not given a spirit of fear. Our Bible tells us that. And the disciples, how often are we like them? They said there is not enough to go around, so we are not sharing anything. But Jesus said, bring it to me. That is the faith, the hope, and the calling into which we are grafted as God's children. Brueggemann writes, our faith is not just about spiritual matters. It is about the transformation of the world. The closer we stay to Jesus, the more we will bring a new economy of abundance to the world. The disciples don't often get what Jesus is about because they keep trying to fit him into old patterns, and to do so is to make him innocuous, irrelevant, and boring. It is much more elemental. The creation is infused with the Creator's generosity, and we can find practices, procedures, and institutions that allow that generosity to work. I really feel that when we as God's people begin to find ways to live into the liturgy of abundance and share that with the world, then we can begin to see the difference this will make in our society. When we ourselves stop living into that fear, when we ourselves stop living into that myth, we can look around and see the world for what it is and what a difference that will make in our society. Now, it is a challenge. It is a calling that asks us to look at the world in a different way. And that's not going to be popular. It is a challenge that pushes us to change and counter how society tells us to be. But this single change can transform the world. Amen.